much, everyone. Let's now switch gears now and speak about issues relating to the economy. Well, of course, the Central Bank of Nigeria, dissolved the board of 3 banks, has now appointed new executives to oversee the affairs of these 3 banks, which boards were dissolved. The CBN said the action was necessary due to the non-compliance of these banks and their respective boards with the provisions of Section 12C, F, G, H of Banks and Other Financial Institutions Act 2020. The activities of Mr. Obaze, the appointed CBN special investigator in July of last year by President Bola Tinubu, which alleged that Emefiele, the former governor of the CBN, used proxies to set up 2 financial institutions, was also another issue raising a lot of concerns in the health of the banking sector in Nigeria. Of course, some of these issues are getting a lot of Nigerians talking about. Tonight, we'll be talking about regional economy, private sector, a lot of elections on the continent. What this means, Nigeria is a major player. If it needs to stay as a major player, what can be done in terms of regional economy? Of course, after tonight, Professor Kingsley Moghalu, a former deputy governor of the Central Bank, is now the chairman of the board of directors and advisory board of the Africa Private Sector Summit, a Pan-African private sector-led organization which has its headquarters in Accra, Ghana. He joins us live. Thank you so much virtually. Thank you so much indeed, Prof, for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for having me.
For those who have followed the CBN and its activities over the last 8 years or more, and knowing that someone like you will be talking to us tonight on the program, are worried about what is going on in the CBN. Are you worried as well? And because some of the things that we are hearing doesn't give the kind of confidence that you should be having in the Apex Bank on one hand, and you are hearing about some of these issues in relation to commercial banks. Looks like deja vu in the years past where commercial banks or some of these unscrupulous activities happen and there are problems in the banking sector.
Well, Cheryl, thank you. First of all, let me be very clear. It is not my impression that I'm here to speak about the Central Bank of Nigeria. I am the chairman of the Africa Private Sector Summit. And, when I was invited, we talked about the business environment in Africa and intra-African trade. So I want to be very clear. I don't want to get into political commentary about, Nigerian institutions, including the central bank. Having said that, the only thing I can say about the central bank or what the central bank has done in the last few hours in terms of sacking the boards of the banks. Of course, the central bank has the powers to do that if it judges that the banks in question are not being well run, they're a threat to financial stability, or that they're not meeting the conditions under which their banking licenses were granted to them. As you know, the banking sector all over the world is about the most regulated business sector on the planet. And that's because banks trade and thrive on other people's money. 80 to 90% of the money with which banks do business is depositors' funds. Only very little is shareholders' funds. So it's a very different model of business, because it sort of depends on the consumer who puts his money in the bank in trust that he or she will find that money when they go there. So that's why banks are very heavily regulated. And specifically on this particular action, I cannot speak to the merits, but I can tell you that the central bank certainly has the authority, the powers to do that. We did it in our time at the central bank for very good reasons too. So that's what I would say. Now, what I find a bit odd, is the context in which this is happening. Because you have to understand that the central bank has to be independent. It has to be professional. And the bank itself has the resources, the authority to be able to investigate any deposit money bank in Nigeria and find out if there are infractions, and if so, take the necessary decisions. But this now seems to be happening from an external stimulus. And that's what is a bit odd about it, that the central bank is now sort of in a position where it would appear, it could be just an appearance, I don't know, that its, regulatory decisions are being dictated by some outside influence or force or entity. I find that a little bit odd because, like I say, central banks have done this in Nigeria time and time again. And it's not a new thing at all, but they did it independently. I mean, in the normal exercise of their banking supervision and regulatory powers.
It's interesting, and and I raised this. Yes, our conversation is centered around the prosperity of the African nation, especially in a very crucial election year. At least 15 countries in Africa, out of the over 1 billion population, will be going into election this year. It means a lot. The fortunes, the prosperity, and how the private sector runs in this whole climate is very key. But yeah, I can't have a Kingsley Moghalu, a former deputy governor of the central bank, and we have this kind of mess going on in Nigeria and not talk about the CBN. It's going to be some kind of anomaly. But thank you so much for your commentary on that. But let's talk about the African continent, the prosperity of this nation, of this continent. Now, 15 African countries at least will be having elections this year. And so one will wonder, what about the African Free Trade Agreement, which about 47 countries are signatory to? Is it working? What is the propriety of it? What are the kind of trade? Nigeria is supposed to be playing a major role. From your organization's point of view, you have your projections, you have your reservations. What are those?
Well, thank you. The Africa Private Sector Summit, which is a continent-wide, private sector-led organization that I happen to be the chairman of its board of directors and executive board, is concerned with the promotion of an enabling business environment for trade and investment in Africa, and specifically intra-African trade, which is the subject of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the AfCFTA. So the chief obstacle to this is that, yes, 47 African countries have ratified the treaty, very spectacular for an African international law. But you cannot make the free trade agreement work on the ground if the normal businessman or woman, the SME that is trading and trying to trade across the border with Ghana or with Togo or with Ivory Coast and so on, or Niger or Benin Republic, if these businesses, in addition to the big corporates, if they cannot do business effectively, if the business environment stops them from creating wealth for Africans, then that treaty will then be just some theoretical law, But there's a potential that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement can create an additional GDP of almost $500 billion, by 2035, and take about 30 million Africans out of poverty. For this to happen, we have to have an enabling business environment in African countries and between African countries. So the APSS, we are mounting a campaign for all African countries, heads of states and governments, to sign at the African Union Summit in 2025 a charter on, a private sector Bill of Rights, with 24 specific guarantees for businesses in African countries. If African leaders can do this, it will help a lot the economies of our countries in the continent. As you rightly said, this year, 2024, is the year of elections. There will be about 50 elections around the world in about 50 countries this year, and about 15 of them are in African countries. From Ghana to South Africa and so many others. And, if people who are aspiring to lead African countries do not understand the role of the private sector in creating wealth for the citizens of their countries, if they don't understand that the private sector has to work and that the business environment has to be an enabling one, then then they don't know what their job is, and you wonder what they're aspiring to do in office. So that's what we are saying.
So you look at it, there are efforts that are being made by, you see the efforts made in Rwanda, but the one that has been more drastic and more progressive, some leaders on the continent will say, is that what President Ruto did in Kenya, the proposition of a borderless continent, where the Kenya is proposing a visa-less travel into that country. So there are a lot of people who say there are issues though, but then that is a forced move for Nigeria and within the West African region. A visa-free travel to Kenya across the globe. What does that portend for trade?
Great things if it is actually implemented. Among the 24 specific rights we are asking African leaders to sign on to and to implement in practice is the right to visa-free travel across the continent. We are also requesting African leaders to understand that the private sector needs to be guaranteed the right to a secure and stable environment. So security is number one. Without an environment that is secure and stable, businesses will not be able to thrive. So you have the situations we have, for example, inside Nigeria, in the Middle Belt, where people are being killed in hundreds, in the northeast, in some parts of the southeast, and so on and so forth. These are very, very disabling situations for people to do business. So the right to security, the right to visa-free travel, the right to a legal system where contracts are, sanctified and cannot be, just treated anyhow. The right to efficient importation and port administration, the right to infrastructure, the right to an educational system that creates the skills that the private sector needs in our continent of Africa to create and drive the fourth industrial revolution. The right of private sector companies to be consulted when laws and regulations are being made. This is very important. Many times our governments have people who don't understand the private sector, and yet they make laws for the economy that impact the private sector, and this turns out sometimes negative. But if you have a consultative relationship with the private sector, this will go better.
Yeah, locally here in Nigeria, although the borders in Nigeria, there are those who describe it as a most porous one. Is it something that the Nigerian government can consider a visa-free to countries on the continent, first and foremost?
Listen, when you say visa-free, it doesn't mean that you just leave your borders porous. People, you still have to manage your borders. Every country does that. But the challenge is with the administration, of immigration. Rwanda has done something like that. I think Kenya is doing that, and you make that rule in favor, especially of people who are coming for business and investment purposes. But you still monitor them and you still enforce your laws. The problem with Nigeria's borders is not whether or not it's visa-free. It's about whether actually we have borders in 80% of Nigeria's exposures to neighboring countries. Are those borders actually manned? Are they being, effectively policed and administered? Is there proper security checks? That's the real issue. Nigeria is a major driver of ECOWAS economy. At least 60% of ECOWAS GDP is Nigeria. So you have to make it, actually work in practice, that people can trade across borders. Why is this very important? I want to say why intra-African trade is really very important and needs to be supported by enabling business environments by governments. The reason is because Africa is the poorest, is the continent in the world today that has the highest rates of poverty still. If you look at our trade patterns, we trade a lot with other countries outside of the African continent. So we engage a lot in global trade, but are we competitive in global trade? No, we're not competitive because more than 60% of global trade is in manufactured and value-added products. And that's not what we are exporting from Africa. We're exporting, natural resources in their raw form. We're exporting agricultural commodities. These things make up less than 10 to 20% of global trade. So global trade is structurally arranged not to be in favor of Africa. Meanwhile, 70% of all trade by European countries is within Europe. 60% of all trade by Asian countries is inside Asia. 30 to 40% of all trade by North American countries is in that region. In Africa, only 14% of our trade is within our own country.
So Professor Moghalu, if I may jump in, right? Nigeria is a major player. For what you know about the Nigerian economy and our area of comparative advantage on the continent and, in fact, in the sub-region, what products do you think that we can leverage on? I mean, if you are a major player, in terms of production that we can export, what would be the product of comparative advantage?
I was saying before you interrupted me that the path to prosperity for Africa lies through intra-African trade. Now to your question about Nigeria. Nigeria has many advantages, but we have to fix the business environment first. And if we don't fix the business environment, we are not going to be able to take advantage of those opportunities. The first thing about the Nigerian business environment is the problem of electricity, because that goes to productivity. If you have reliable electricity, then you can be a productive economy, then you can export goods that are manufactured in Nigeria across the African continent. So we have advantages in the areas of agriculture. We can process agricultural products, add value to them, and trade across our borders. We have advantages in the area of services. The services economy is growing very big in Nigeria, and we can export our services. And not just even in Africa, but around the world. People can sit inside Nigeria and perform IT and other technological services and earn a lot of money, a lot of forex, because their wages will be less than people, say, in London or in New York. So you use the fact of lower wages to your advantage, which China used to rise economically. And now some investment is going out of China into cheaper places like Vietnam, like Bangladesh, and so on. So these are the ways in which we can proceed. We no longer talk about comparative advantage in modern economics. That's an archaic concept. We talk about competitive advantage. That is what drives global trade, the ability to use products that may not even be indigenous to your locality, to manufacture things that are valuable at good cost and export them. After all the manufactures that we're getting from the Western world, are the raw materials in the West? No, the raw materials are here in our continent. Yet, because they have competitive advantage, they turn those raw materials into products and sell to us. They get rich while we get poor.
A lot of lessons to take away, and I look at it. In fact, some countries in Africa are having problems because they are heavily indebted to countries in Asia and in Europe and America as well. You look at it from 2010 to 2022, the percentage of GDP, Africa's share of external debt has risen astronomically. It's risen from about 19% in 2010 to about 29% in 2022, and it's gone even higher in the last year. By December, I'm not sure what figure that has stood at. And you look at it, infrastructure is a major problem to be able to drive the economy. And there are those who say most of these debts are in dollars. America can decide to write its own debt off because it's in their own currency. Where can Africa, or how can Africa survive in the face of this external debt to the GDP ratio?
That's a huge problem. It's a huge problem, Sheryl, but that's because of very weak economic management in African countries. That's why we borrow so much. It's not that debt is bad, but why do we borrow? How do we borrow? And what do we borrow for? As a general principle, you have to borrow only if it's absolutely necessary, if it's the best course of action, and for productive purposes. You have to do a calculation of what the investment of the debt funds in, how they will actually drive up the GDP of the country, how they will be sustainable for repayment. That's how you borrow and why you borrow. We also borrow a lot because we don't understand the role of the state in managing the economy. A lot of the infrastructures we borrow for or claim to borrow for can be done as PPP arrangements with private countries, with private companies. But many African countries don't do this. They like to go around saying they're looking for money. Meanwhile, they're being so wasteful inside their own country. And people will lend you money because it's their business to lend you money. They make money by lending you money. That's their own business plan. So if, as a country, an African country does not keep its debt very manageable, then this is quite catastrophic and doesn't leave you with any oxygen, doesn't leave you with room to breathe, you know. But that's because many of them are not following the right models. And there's a lot of corruption, of course. We know that. It goes on in many countries. So, you know, Africa's debt sustainability, if we want to speak specifically about Nigeria, where we are spending almost 100% of our revenues paying debt, and our oil revenues are increasingly being pawned for more borrowings. You know, we're pawning our future oil revenues for debt. Right. I find this a very, very problematic approach, and I think we need to be a little bit more original in our thinking, and yeah, there's a lot more we can do much better.
Professor Kingsley Moghalu, looks so much like a professorial conversation tonight with you on the regional economy, Africa trade, regional economy and all that. A former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank, who is now the chair of the Board of Directors and Advisory Board of the Africa Private Sector Summit, a private sector-led organization which is based in Accra, Ghana, which promotes trade and investment on the continent. Thank you so much, Prof, for your time tonight on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.